Racist man slaps black kid mid-flight. Seconds later, a stranger stands up and changes everything. The sound cracked through the cabin, louder than the engines, louder than the flight attendant's safety instructions still echoing faintly in people's ears. For a heartbeat, there was silence, an unnatural kind that froze every passenger mid-breath. Then gasps rippled down the aisle as a boy's head snapped to the side, his cheek reddening where the man's palm had landed. Every set of eyes turned toward row 16. The boy, no older than 16, sat stunned, his body stiff, his fingers gripping the seat back in front of him as though it might anchor him against the humiliation spreading across his face. His name was Marcus Williams, a bright student traveling to a competition that meant the world to him. Yet in this moment, all anyone could see was a boy struck for daring to exist in the wrong place, beside the wrong man. That man, Warren Caldwell, remained standing over him, jaw clenched, his fingers stabbing the air. His words sliced through the silence. "Stay in your place, boy." The venom of it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A woman clutched her pearls. Another passenger's hand flew to her mouth. From multiple rows back, phones shot into the air, recording with the speed of instinct. Screens lit up the cabin like dozens of unblinking eyes, ensuring this act of hate wouldn't remain trapped at 36,000 feet. Flight attendants rushed forward, their polished shoes clicking against the narrow aisle, but they were too far to intervene in time. For 3 long seconds, it was as if the plane itself held its breath, suspended between outrage and fear. Passengers didn't just see a slap. They saw decades of history condensed into one explosive gesture. They saw arrogance, entitlement, and raw hatred playing out in a space where no one could simply walk away. Marcus sat frozen. He didn't cry out, didn't retaliate. His silence made the moment worse because it highlighted the imbalance, an adult man towering over a child, daring him to respond. Caldwell's face was flushed, his hands trembling with fury that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than a cramped airline seat. His presence dominated the row, spilling into Marcus's space like an invading force. One man's hatred had turned the cabin into a courtroom in the sky, and every passenger suddenly became a witness. If you're just joining us, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss powerful stories like this one. And drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from. We'd love to know where our community is tuning in. As the flight attendants drew closer, Caldwell barked again, his voice sharp enough to sting. "People like you should learn respect. You don't belong here." The girl in the window seat, who had been quietly reading a book minutes before, recoiled in horror. Her hand hovered near Marcus's shoulder, wanting to comfort him, but fear held her back. Around them, murmurs began to spread, growing louder with each passing second. "Did he really hit that kid? Somebody do something." This is going online. The tension spread like fire in a dry field. No one wanted to move first, yet no one could look away. Even the captain's voice over the intercom would not have broken the spell that held the cabin. And then, quietly, a figure stirred several rows back. An older man, hair flecked with gray, pushed himself up from his seat with deliberate calm. There was nothing imposing about his frame, nothing flashy about his clothes, but the way he rose, unhurried, steady, absolute, commanded attention in a way Caldwell's outburst never could. For the first time since the slap, the cabin shifted. Dozens of eyes turned away from the aggressor and toward the man now standing in the aisle. He did not shout, he did not hurry. He simply stood there, watching. And in that moment, everyone knew something was about to change. 6 hours earlier, Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport pulsed with its usual rhythm. Families dragging suitcases, business travelers tapping away on tablets, voices colliding in a constant hum. Among them was 16-year-old Marcus Williams, clutching his backpack straps a little tighter than usual. This trip wasn't just another journey, it was a test of everything he had been working toward. His father, Dr. David Williams, walked beside him, tall and commanding in his Navy suit. A renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, he carried himself with the calm precision of a man who had saved countless lives. Yet in this moment, his focus wasn't on patients, but on his only child. "You've got your boarding pass?" Dr. Williams asked for the 3rd time in less than 15 minutes. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Dad, still in my wallet, right where you checked it last time. And your files." The presentation, the backup on the drive, and the email to Professor Diaz? I've got all of it. Triple saved, just like you wanted. Marcus softened his voice, hoping to ease the crease in his father's forehead. The weight of expectation pressed in. This wasn't just a flight to Los Angeles, it was the National Science Decathlon, a stage where Marcus would present his research on gravitational waves. His father had called him a legacy in more than one speech, reminding him that excellence was the only option. Yet behind Marcus's determination lay a wound that hadn't fully healed: his mother's absence. Nearly a year had passed since she'd left for what she called a short sabbatical. In Paris, 6 weeks had stretched into months, and her return grew less certain with every phone call that never came. Marcus had filled the silence with discipline, balancing schoolwork, house chores, and the quiet ache of a fractured family. He never spoke about it, but his father's eyes sometimes lingered too long, as if silently apologizing for the burden placed on a boy forced to grow up fast. "You're ready," Dr. Williams finally said, resting both hands on his son's shoulders. His voice wavered between pride and nerves. Not just for the competition, but for everything. Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat and gave a small smile. "Thanks, Dad. I should probably get in line. They're boarding my group." The farewell hug was brief but fierce. Then Marcus turned toward security, rolling his shoulders back like a soldier bracing for battle. The lines crawled forward inch by inch. He felt the stares before he saw them, an older woman whispering to her companion while casting quick glances in his direction, a gate agent checking his ID just a little longer than necessary. Marcus knew the script well: suspicion first, curiosity second, reluctant acceptance third. At 6'1" in sneakers and a hoodie, he drew judgments before he spoke a single word. Still, he carried himself with deliberate composure, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "Never let them decide who you are before you've opened your mouth." At the gate, he nearly collided with a man in a tailored gray suit. The man turned sharply, irritation etched across his face. Silver hair combed immaculately back, cufflinks glinting under the fluorescent lights, he exuded money and entitlement. His lips pulled into a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Careful there, young man. Watch where you're going." The words weren't harsh, but the tone carried something heavier, a subtle edge meant to remind Marcus of his place. Straightening, Marcus met the man's gaze and replied evenly, his voice measured. "My apologies, sir. Just distracted for a moment." The man gave a curt nod before turning away, but not before Marcus caught the flicker of something. Dismissal, maybe even disdain. He'd seen that look before, the one that surfaced when his vocabulary or demeanor didn't fit the box people had built around him. As Marcus moved into the boarding line, a gentle voice stopped him. An older woman with silver hair and kind eyes leaned on her cane, smiling warmly. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Going to Los Angeles for a science competition." The answer came quickly, practiced from years of preempting assumptions. Her smile widened. "The National Science Decathlon? My grandson competed once. Didn't make the finals, but he's at Georgia Tech now. You must be very talented." Relief softened Marcus's posture. "That's where I hope to go, or maybe MIT, if the scholarship works out." "You'll do well, I can tell," she said, before boarding was called for her section. Her words lingered like a quiet encouragement, a reminder that not every stranger carried sharp edges. Yet as Marcus moved forward with his group, sliding his boarding pass across the scanner, his eyes caught a familiar figure. The man in the gray suit strode confidently down the jet bridge, his polished shoes striking the floor like a metronome. Marcus's chest tightened as realization set in. They weren't just sharing the same flight, they were headed to the same cabin. And something told him this man's shadow would stretch far longer than a few cramped hours in the air. The jet bridge narrowed into the cool, recycled air of the cabin. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack and glanced down at his boarding pass. Seat 16B, the middle. He let out a quiet sigh. Of all the places on the aircraft, fate had decided to wedge him between two strangers. Row 16 came into view, and his stomach dropped. The aisle seat was already occupied by the same man from the gate, the one with the tailored gray suit, silver hair brushed immaculately back, tablet glowing in his hands. Warren Caldwell. The man looked up, recognition flickering instantly. followed by a flash of annoyance. With visible reluctance, he pushed himself to his feet, as though even the act of letting Marcus pass was an inconvenience. "I had hoped you might be seated elsewhere," he muttered, voice pitched low but sharp enough to cut. Marcus ignored the jab, focusing on sliding into his assigned spot without brushing against Caldwell's expensive suit. To his right, by the window, sat a girl about his age. Dark hair framed her face, and in her hands rested a well-worn paperback. She glanced up, offered a quick smile, then lowered her eyes again. The plane filled rapidly, overhead bins snapping shut as flight attendants urged passengers to stow their bags. The safety announcement began its practiced routine, but Marcus was already aware of a different battle taking shape. It started with the armrest. Caldwell shifted just enough that his elbow pressed firmly into Marcus's space. Marcus instinctively pulled back, shrinking himself smaller in the narrow seat. Then he remembered his father's words, "Don't give anyone the satisfaction of erasing you." With deliberate calm, Marcus set his arm back down, claiming the space that was equally his. Caldwell stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Not yet. The engines roared, vibrations shuddering through the cabin as the aircraft began taxiing. Marcus gripped the armrest briefly, his nerves showing. A light tap on his sleeve made him glance to the right. The girl in the window seat tilted her book, revealing the cover. "Dune," she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "First time reading it?" Marcus managed a small smile. "Yeah, my dad loves it. Figured I'd give it a try before watching the movie." Her eyes lit with interest. "Good choice." "I'm Sophie. Looks like we're neighbors for the next few hours." He nodded. "Marcus." Their exchange was brief, but something in Sophie's easy friendliness steadied him. For a moment, the tightness in his chest eased. Caldwell broke the calm almost immediately. "Some of us would like quiet," he said flatly, eyes never leaving his tablet. Sophie's brows lifted. "We'll try not to disturb your spreadsheets." Her tone carried just enough sweetness to sting. Marcus stifled a laugh, though the tension between his roommates was unmistakable. Caldwell shifted again, elbow back in place, his body language radiating ownership of the row. He exuded the kind of authority that expected obedience without question. As the plane climbed into the sky, Marcus tried to lose himself in music. But even the faint beat through his earbuds couldn't block the constant press of Caldwell's presence. The territorial elbow, the clipped sighs, the muttered irritation when Sophie turned a page too loudly. Every small action carried a message. "You don't belong here." Still, Marcus held his ground. He sat tall, responded politely when necessary, and refused to vanish into the seat. Resilience wasn't about shouting back. It was about refusing to be made small. The flight leveled off above the clouds. Attendants wheeled carts through the aisle, offering drinks and snacks. Caldwell declined without looking up. Marcus accepted a water, thanking the attendant with practiced politeness. Sophie asked for ginger ale and cracked it open, the fizz filling the air between them. The row settled into a tense equilibrium until Caldwell broke it again. He leaned slightly toward Marcus, his words slipping out under his breath, intended for one set of ears only. "They let anyone sit up here these days." The words were laced with disdain, their meaning undeniable. Sophie's head turned sharply, her eyes narrowing as if she'd caught the edge of it. Marcus's hands clenched under the tray table, but he forced his expression to remain neutral. Caldwell returned to his tablet, smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, satisfied with his whispered strike. The flight had only just begun, but the hostility in row 16 was already climbing to dangerous altitudes. The plane had settled into its steady rhythm, engines humming against the backdrop of quiet conversations and clinking ice cubes in plastic cups. Marcus tried to focus on the view outside the window, an endless stretch of white clouds rolling beneath them, but his attention kept returning to the man at his side. Warren Caldwell hadn't said another word since his muttered remark. He didn't need to. Every gesture, every shift in his seat carried the same message: dominance. The first jolt of turbulence hit without warning, rattling the tray tables and making drinks tremble. Passengers gasped, then chuckled nervously as the seatbelt sign dinged overhead. Sophie glanced out the window, one eyebrow raised. "That wasn't too bad," she whispered. Caldwell exhaled sharply, as if even her small attempt at comfort was an interruption. He shifted in his seat, his elbow pressing hard into Marcus's arm again. This time, it wasn't subtle. "Sorry," Marcus said automatically, though he hadn't been the one intruding. He adjusted his position, giving Caldwell an inch of space, an inch that was quickly taken as a foot. Caldwell sprawled wider, scrolling through his tablet as if the boy beside him didn't exist. Another bump rattled the cabin, sending Marcus's water cup sliding slightly on the tray. Caldwell's arm swung abruptly, knocking it over. The spill soaked Marcus's sleeve before dripping onto his jeans. Marcus jerked back, fumbling for the napkin Sophie quickly handed him. "It's fine," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. But Caldwell's response was cold. "Maybe next time, keep your drink where it belongs." Marcus froze, napkin clenched in his hand. The words stung not for their content, but for their implication. The man hadn't just blamed him, he'd marked him, targeting his presence as the problem. Sophie shifted forward in her seat, lips pressed thin, but Marcus gave her the faintest shake of his head. He wasn't going to give Caldwell the satisfaction of a scene. The turbulence returned, heavier this time, bouncing the plane hard enough that overhead compartments creaked. Flight attendants braced themselves on seatbacks, announcing with strained cheer, "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Caldwell grunted in irritation. They really let these flights go to anyone now. No standards anymore. Marcus turned his head, meeting the man's eyes squarely for the first time. His voice was steady, deliberate. "I have just as much right to be here as you do." The words weren't loud, but their firmness cut through the row like steel. Caldwell blinked, surprised at the resistance. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then he smirked, leaning back in his seat, muttering just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "We'll see about that." Marcus returned to dabbing at his sleeve, his hand steady despite the fire in his chest. He wasn't going to shrink. Not this time. Around them, whispers stirred. A woman across the aisle exchanged a glance with her husband. A young man 2 rows up peeked over his shoulder, eyebrows raised. The tension wasn't private anymore. The row had become a stage, and others were watching. The cabin rocked again, harder, making the aisle cart rattle. Sophie steadied her ginger ale with one hand and leaned closer to Marcus. Her voice was low, urgent. "I think he's trying to provoke you." The aircraft jolted once more, trays rattling and overhead bins groaning. Passengers gripped their armrests, murmurs of unease fluttering through the cabin. Row 16, however, was already its own storm. Caldwell's irritation, simmering since boarding, finally boiled over. He shifted in his seat with a suddenness that startled Sophie, his elbow slamming into Marcus's side harder than before. "Enough," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. "Please keep your space." The sentence was polite, respectful even, but Caldwell's face flushed red as though he'd been insulted before the entire cabin. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and then, without hesitation, his hand whipped across the narrow divide. The slap landed with a crack that tore through the steady drone of the engines. For an instant there was no sound. No coughs, no chatter, not even the rustle of magazines. Just the ringing echo of flesh against flesh. Marcus's head jerked sideways, his cheek burning, the sting radiating through his skull. His eyes widened, more in shock than pain, his body frozen mid-breath. A 16-year-old boy struck across the face at 30,000 feet. Sophie gasped, hand flying to her mouth. "Did you just—" Her voice broke, disbelief choking the rest of the words. All around them, passengers reacted at once. A woman in the row ahead twisted around, eyes wide. Someone 2 seats back let out a sharp, "Hey!" Phones appeared almost instantly, screens rising into the air like a forest of witnesses. Red recording lights blinked, capturing the moment that had turned a crowded flight into a courtroom in the sky. Caldwell stayed standing, his chest heaving, his hand still trembling from the force of the strike. "I told you to stay in your place, boy," he snarled, his finger stabbing the air in Marcus's direction. The words carried the venom of centuries, heavy and inescapable. No one could mistake the meaning. No one could dismiss it as a misunderstanding. The entitlement, the hatred, the belief that he could raise his hand against a black child without consequence, it was laid bare for every soul on board to see. Marcus remained frozen, his mind struggling to process the violence. He didn't speak, didn't lift a hand to his cheek, didn't look away. His silence, his stillness, made the strike feel louder, more vicious. Sophie broke it first. "He's a kid," she shouted, her voice cutting through the paralysis that had gripped the cabin. "You can't just hit him." Flight attendants scrambled up the aisle, their faces tight with urgency. "Sir, sit down immediately," one barked, her voice betraying a tremor of alarm. But Caldwell wasn't finished. He jabbed his finger toward Marcus again, his words rising into a shout. "This generation doesn't know respect. He thinks he can talk back, take what isn't his. Well, not next to me. Not on my row." The rage twisted his features, turning him into something feral. His outburst filled the cabin, and every passenger was forced to confront the truth of what they were seeing. This wasn't about a spilled drink or a crowded seat or turbulence. It was about race. It was about power. And Caldwell had revealed it with every word dripping from his mouth. "Sir, sit down now," a flight attendant demanded again, her hand hovering near the intercom phone. Caldwell turned his glare on her. "Do your job. People like him shouldn't even be here. You let standards slip, and this is what happens." Murmurs rippled through the rows, some angry, some shocked, all electric with disbelief. A man in the aisle seat across from Marcus leaned forward, his phone steady as he recorded. A young woman whispered, "Oh my God," over and over, rocking in her seat. And through it all, Marcus sat still, his cheek burning, his dignity intact, even as the cabin around him seemed to spin. Then, from 7 rows back, a chair scraped against the floor. An older man rose slowly, steadying himself with one hand on the headrest in front of him. He was unremarkable at first glance, gray hair thinning, jacket a little worn at the elbows, posture neither tall nor commanding. But when he straightened fully and spoke, his voice carried down the aisle with clarity that silenced every whisper. "That's enough." The cabin stilled again, this time not in shock but in anticipation. Dozens of eyes swung from Caldwell's fury to the man who had just risen. And in that moment, the balance of the entire flight shifted. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in altitude. "That's enough." Every head in the cabin turned toward the source. The man who had risen from row 23 looked ordinary at first glance. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled to the forearms. His jacket hung slightly loose at the shoulders, showing signs of long wear. But his presence filled the aisle in a way no amount of wealth or status ever could. Michael Cavich. Few on board knew his name yet, but the weight of his voice cut sharper than Caldwell's shouting. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate. No rush, no hesitation. Just the certainty of someone who had faced storms far worse than an angry businessman on a plane. His gaze fixed on Caldwell, unblinking, unflinching. "Sit down," Caldwell barked, his voice still high with fury. "This doesn't concern you." Michael's reply came low, steady. "When a grown man strikes a child, it concerns every decent person in this cabin." The air thickened. Passengers exchanged glances, shifting in their seats, whispers passing like sparks. A few phones tilted from Marcus to Michael, lenses catching the confrontation as it unfolded. Flight attendants arrived at the row, their hands raised as though they could press the tension back into silence. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled tightly into a bun, spoke quickly. "Sir, please take your seat. We're handling the situation." Michael didn't move. "No. You've had your chance. You watched him hit that boy, and you hesitated." His eyes swept briefly across the attendants before returning to Caldwell. "I will not." The firmness in his tone unsettled even the crew. Airline rules demanded authority remain with them. But Michael's words struck deeper than protocol. They spoke to conscience. Caldwell sneered, puffing out his chest. "And who exactly do you think you are?" Michael paused, and for a heartbeat it seemed he might not answer. Then, with the clarity of someone who had lived through fire and loss, he said, "A man who's tired of watching cowards hide behind money and anger." The ripple that ran through the cabin was unmistakable. A soft yes from somewhere behind. A murmur of agreement 2 rows up. Courage had entered the aisle, and it was contagious. Marcus, still seated, felt it too. His cheek burned, but the sight of Michael standing tall shifted something inside him. For the first time since the slap, he no longer felt alone. The attendants exchanged quick glances, uncertain. Caldwell seized on their hesitation. "You hear that? He's threatening me? This is harassment. Get him back to his seat, or I'll have your jobs." But Michael didn't blink. He stepped closer, closing the space between himself and the businessman. The calm in his movements only sharpened the contrast with Caldwell's frantic energy. "You've humiliated yourself enough," Michael said. "Sit down before you make it worse." Gasps came from the passengers. Some leaned forward, phones held higher. Others nodded quietly, relief visible in their eyes. The balance of power in row 16 was shifting, and Caldwell felt it. He jabbed a finger toward Marcus again, his voice desperate. "This boy." Michael cut him off, his voice suddenly carrying like thunder. "You don't get to call him boy. Not while I'm standing here." The word silenced Caldwell mid-sentence. The weight of history inside that one word, boy, was undeniable. The line had been drawn. One of the attendants placed a hand on Michael's arm, pleading, "Sir, please, we need you to sit down." Michael's head turned slightly, his voice softer but no less firm. "I've sat down my whole life while men like him got away with it. Not today." The statement rolled through the cabin, igniting murmurs of approval. A young woman near the back called out, "He's right." Someone else added, "Protect the kid." The quiet defiance that had been simmering burst into open support. Phones recorded, eyes widened. Passengers who had been silent now found themselves leaning into the moment, their fear transforming into solidarity. Caldwell's face flushed deeper. "This is outrageous. He assaulted me with his words. I'll have you all arrested when we land." But Michael stood his ground, unshaken. He turned back to the attendants, his voice carrying over the rising noise of the cabin. "This man needs to be restrained before he hurts that boy again." The demand hit like a second slap, only this time, aimed at Caldwell's authority. The cabin erupted. Gasps, shouts, clapping, disbelief all at once. The attendants froze, caught between procedure and the undeniable truth in Michael's voice. And for the first time since the slap, Caldwell's confidence faltered. For a heartbeat, Caldwell seemed stunned by Michael's demand. His jaw worked, his eyes darting to the attendants who still hovered uncertainly. Then his lips curled into a smile, not one of amusement, but of menace. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he sneered. His voice carried loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Do you even know who I am? I sit on the board of 2 Fortune 500 companies. I can buy and sell this airline with a single phone call. One word from me and you'll be nothing." He jabbed a finger at Michael's chest, his movements sharp and jerky now. "You're just some washed-up nobody looking for attention. Sit down before I make sure you regret ever standing up." Michael didn't blink. His hands rested calmly at his sides, his posture steady. "I've been threatened by men with far more power than you. I didn't back down then, and I won't back down now." The cabin shifted again, passengers leaning in, drawn to the collision between arrogance and quiet resolve. A woman whispered, "He's not scared of him," and another answered, "Finally, someone isn't." Caldwell's smirk faltered. For years, intimidation had been his sharpest weapon, but Michael's steady gaze met him like a wall, unyielding, immovable. Marcus sat frozen in his seat, cheek still burning from the slap. Yet his eyes never left Michael. Awe spread slowly across his face. For the first time since boarding, the weight pressing down on his chest seemed to lift. Someone was standing up for him, not with anger, but with a courage that made the businessman's fury look small. Caldwell barked a bitter laugh, masking his unease. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. A relic. This isn't your fight." Michael's answer was simple, unshaken. "Any fight against hate is mine." A murmur of approval rippled through the rows. Heads nodded. Phones captured every word. Caldwell turned sharply, realizing the audience wasn't just recording him. They were siding against him. His authority was slipping, and with it, the careful mask of control he had worn for decades. He raised his voice, desperate now. "This boy disrespected me. This entire generation thinks they're entitled to everything. You people don't understand how the world works. Respect is earned, and he hasn't earned it." Sophie shot forward in her seat, her voice fierce. "Respect isn't earned with fists, and he's already 10 times the man you'll ever be." Applause broke from a few scattered seats, quick and sharp. It wasn't loud enough to fill the cabin, but it was enough to make Caldwell's face redden with rage. "Quiet," he shouted, pointing wildly at Sophie before turning back to Michael. "Do you hear this? They're siding with a child and a nobody against me? This is madness." But the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. Each word revealed the cracks in his authority. His superiority complex, once carefully polished, now looked like desperation. Michael didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You hit a boy and expected silence, but silence is over. The effect was immediate. More passengers nodded, some whispering to each other with urgency. The energy in the cabin shifted from shock to defiance. A man in row 18 muttered, "He's right." Another, clutching his phone, whispered. Finally, someone said it. Marcus felt the change too. His fear hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer paralyzing. Watching Michael stand so firmly planted a seed inside him, a realization that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was simply refusing to move. Caldwell, however, couldn't stand the growing tide against him. His face twisted with rage, veins straining at his temples. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the dominance slipping from his grasp. "You want to fight?" he snarled, stepping forward suddenly. "Then let's see if you can still stand when I'm finished with you." Gasps erupted across the cabin as Caldwell lunged toward Michael, his arms swinging out as if to shove him back into the seats. But this time, he didn't reach his target. Two passengers rose at once, one from the aisle across, another from the row behind, planting themselves firmly between Caldwell and Michael. Their hands shot out, pressing against Caldwell's shoulders, blocking his advance. "Sit down," one of them snapped. "You're not laying a hand on anyone else." The cabin erupted in voices, some shouting, some cheering, all electric with the realization that the balance had shifted. Caldwell was no longer the man in control. And for the first time, it was clear. The passengers weren't going to let him get away with it. The cabin had frozen again, not because of fear this time, but because of choice. The moment passengers rose to block Caldwell's advance, the atmosphere shifted. And in that tense silence, eyes flicked back to the man who had started it all. Not Caldwell, but the quiet figure who'd stood up first. Michael Cavich. To understand why he refused to sit down, the story had begun long before this flight, long before Marcus Williams had ever boarded a plane. Just 3 days earlier, Michael had been in his small home outside Atlanta, trimming tomato plants in the garden his late wife once adored. The call had come from his doctor. The voice on the other end was steady but heavy. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Months at best, maybe less. Aggressive treatment could buy time, but not much, and it would steal whatever dignity he had left. Michael had thanked her, asked a few practical questions, and hung up the phone. He had survived the jungle of Vietnam, the empty silence of losing friends to war, and the long ache of burying his wife after cancer claimed her too. But that call stripped away every illusion of more time. 4 to 6 months. He had no bucket list. No exotic vacations, no expensive toys. What he had was something heavier, a ledger of regrets. He had seen racism up close, not just in headlines, but in daily moments where cruelty was dismissed as normal. In the factory jobs he worked before retirement, black coworkers passed over for promotions despite being twice as skilled. On buses where slurs were whispered loud enough to sting. In diners where waitresses pretended not to hear insults hurled at families just trying to eat. And through it all, Michael had sat silent. Not because he agreed, but because silence was safe. Silence didn't cost him his job. Silence didn't make enemies. Silence let him keep moving while others bore the weight. That silence had haunted him. He told himself he'd done enough in Vietnam, that he had earned peace, but deep down he knew better. He had watched hate win too many times because people like him, people who could have said something, chose comfort instead. So when the doctor told him the clock was running out, Michael understood what it meant. The garden could wait. What mattered now was whether he would leave this world as a man who stayed seated his whole life, or one who finally stood. That's why he booked a ticket to Los Angeles, not for leisure, but for a chance to do something meaningful before the end. He hadn't known what that chance would look like. He only knew he was done living quietly. And here it was, delivered in the most ordinary of places. An airplane aisle. He looked at Marcus, tall, bright-eyed, still stunned from the slap, and saw a boy who could have been any of the men he'd once sat beside in factories, on buses, in diners. A boy who shouldn't have to carry the humiliation of violence while strangers looked away. No, Michael thought. Not this time. Caldwell's shouting barely registered anymore. Michael had faced mortars, hunger, and the gnawing guilt of walking away from brothers who didn't survive the war. What was one arrogant man with a suit and a loud voice compared to that? The attendants wavered, their voices trying to reassert order, but Michael's voice cut through stronger. It wasn't rage, it wasn't volume, it was conviction, the kind that doesn't bend. He had stood because he could no longer sit, because the cancer in his body wasn't the only disease he wanted to confront, because hate left unchecked grows and silence only feeds it. Caldwell sneered at him again, throwing words like weapons. "You don't matter. You're nothing. Sit down before you embarrass yourself." Michael's reply came like stone laid across an open grave. "If I don't stop this here, I'll die knowing I was a coward." The cabin felt utterly still. Every passenger knew those words weren't a figure of speech. They were truth. Michael's words still lingered in the air, echoing with a gravity that silenced even the engine's steady roar. For the first time since the slap, Caldwell faltered. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting not at Marcus, not even at Michael, but at the passengers surrounding him. Dozens of eyes burned into him, unflinching, and slowly, one by one, people began to rise. A young man 2 rows back stood with his phone outstretched, filming steadily. "Everyone seeing this," he said firmly. "You're not hiding behind money this time." Across the aisle, a woman with a toddler on her lap spoke up. "You struck a child. That's all anyone needs to know." Her voice carried both fury and maternal fire. More voices joined in, layered and insistent. "Sit down. Leave him alone. You don't get to talk like that." The once passive silence of the cabin shifted into something heavier, something stronger. It was no longer one man against a boy. It was one man against a plane full of witnesses who had decided, almost in unison, that they would not be silent. Caldwell's face twisted. He puffed out his chest as though the sheer force of arrogance might shield him from their judgment. "Do you people know who I am?" he barked. "I'll have every one of you banned from flying again. I can end careers with a single phone call. You think you can gang up on me?" But the voices didn't stop. A man in a baseball cap called out, "We don't care who you are. You don't hit a kid." Another added sharply, "Your name's already trending." Caldwell spun, his confidence cracking as phones captured him from every angle. His bluster had always worked before, in boardrooms, in luxury restaurants, in spaces where his title and his wealth carried weight. But here, thousands of feet in the sky, those tools meant nothing. And standing steady in the aisle was Michael, the immovable center of it all. Marcus, still in his seat, stared at the scene unfolding. His cheek still burned, but something inside him shifted. The sting of humiliation began to fade, replaced by a warmth he hadn't expected. Solidarity. Sophie noticed the look on his face and touched his hand gently. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered. The words cracked the wall Marcus had been holding up since the slap. He blinked hard, swallowing the lump in his throat. For the first time since boarding, he didn't feel small. Michael turned slightly, catching Marcus's gaze. He gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "You matter. You always did." The cabin had changed. The fear of speaking up had evaporated, replaced by a collective courage that fed on itself. Passengers who had been frozen in shock minutes earlier now leaned forward, their voices louder, their postures firmer. Even the flight attendants, so long trained to maintain order above all else, looked shaken. They had rules, protocols. But they also had eyes, and those eyes told them the truth. One man had attacked a boy, and now the entire cabin demanded justice. Caldwell's arrogance crumbled in the face of that unity. His voice rose higher, shriller, desperation seeping through every word. "You're all making a mistake. This is harassment. I'll sue every one of you. I'll—" "Enough," someone shouted from the back, and the plane erupted in agreement. Passengers began standing in clusters now, some crossing the aisle to stand nearer to Michael, their presence a wall of defiance. The businessman, once so certain of his power, looked small, boxed in by ordinary people who had chosen courage over silence. Sophie squeezed Marcus's hand again. "See? They're with you. All of them." Marcus exhaled shakily, the knot in his chest loosening. For once, the burden didn't feel like his alone. The attendants, realizing the moment had grown far beyond their control, exchanged a quick glance. One picked up the intercom phone, her voice tight but firm. "Captain, we need you at the cabin immediately. We have a passenger disturbance." Every head lifted. The announcement confirmed what they already knew. This wasn't going away. Authority higher than the attendants was now aware, and judgment would no longer be left to the court of whispers and smartphones. From the cockpit came a brief, clipped response, carried through the intercom. "We've been alerted. Law enforcement will be waiting on landing." The words rolled through the rows like a verdict. And for the first time, Caldwell's bluster gave way to something else entirely: fear. The captain's announcement lingered in the cabin like a promise. Law enforcement will be waiting on landing. The passengers, tense but resolute, sank back into their seats. Caldwell, however, would not stop. He paced the narrow strip of aisle beside row 16, still spitting words like venom. "This is absurd. Do you have any idea who I am? When we land, you'll all regret this, every single one of you." But the voices of defiance no longer trembled. They pushed back. A man 2 rows up called out, "We know exactly who you are now." Another added, "And the whole world's about to know too." Bones kept recording. Each second captured another piece of evidence. Caldwell's bluster, his threats, his face twisted in rage, it was all documented. The final hour of the flight passed under that tense but steady watch. Michael stood near Marcus's row, never once returning to his seat. His presence was silent armor, his posture a shield that no threat could penetrate. Passengers nodded to him as if acknowledging an unspoken truth. He was the reason order held. The wheels finally kissed the runway, the thud jarring but steady. Relief swept through the cabin in a single exhale. The voice of the captain returned, firmer this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, please remain seated until authorities meet us at the gate." The plane slowed, taxied, and came to a stop. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but no one moved. Every eye turned forward, waiting. When the doors opened, it wasn't flight attendants who stepped in first. It was uniformed officers. 3 of them, calm but commanding, their presence shifting the power dynamic instantly. "Which passenger is Warren Caldwell?" one asked. Dozens of fingers pointed in unison. Caldwell froze, the color draining from his face. "This is a mistake," he stammered, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. "They've twisted the story. That boy was disrespectful. He provoked me." "Sir, we have multiple reports you struck a minor," the officer replied. "That's a lie," Caldwell shouted, his voice cracking. "They're exaggerating. Look at them, ganging up on me. This is some mob." But the mob spoke with one voice. "He hit him. We saw it. It's all on video." Bones lifted again, screens held toward the officers, each glowing rectangle a nail in the coffin of Caldwell's defense. The officer's expression hardened. "Sir, you're coming with us." "No, you don't understand." Caldwell thrashed as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "I'm a respected man. I'll ruin every one of you." But his words fell into a sea of disbelieving stares. The arrogance that had fueled him was gone, replaced by the unmistakable panic of a man stripped of his shield. As Caldwell was escorted off the plane, a strange quiet filled the cabin. Not fear this time, but relief. Marcus sat trembling, the sting of the slap still on his cheek, but a wall of strangers now surrounded him. People leaned in to reassure him. "You're safe now. You did nothing wrong. We've got you." For the first time in hours, his hands unclenched. Michael eased back into his seat, his body suddenly heavy. He pressed a hand to his eyes, shoulders shaking once. It wasn't weakness. It was release. The strength he had summoned had carried him through, but now the cost of it pressed down like weight from the sky itself. A flight attendant crouched beside him, her voice low. "Sir, are you all right?" Michael gave a tired nod. "Better than I've been in a long time." He turned his gaze back to Marcus. The boy met his eyes, and in that moment, words weren't necessary. They shared something deeper than gratitude, deeper than defiance. Marcus leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Michael's lips curved into a small, weary smile. His reply carried the quiet finality of a man who had waited a lifetime to speak these words. "No. Thank you, son." The jet bridge hissed as the door swung open, and the narrow space filled instantly with noise. Reporters and passengers waiting for their connections craned their necks toward the unusual sight of police officers escorting a cuffed executive through the corridor. Warren Caldwell fought against the grip on his arms, his voice rising in desperation. "You can't do this to me. I'm on the board of..." But the words were drowned out by the chorus of clicking cameras and recording phones. Security officers flanked him, their steady steps matching the officers leading the way. His tie hung askew, sweat beaded at his temples, and the once polished man looked small, trapped in the glare of a spotlight he could no longer control. Passengers from the flight followed behind, some murmuring, some still filming. Within minutes, the videos were already hitting social media platforms, captions blazing: "Businessman assaults black teenager mid-flight. Passenger unity saves young boy from racist attack." Clips spread like wildfire, shared by strangers across the world who had never stepped foot on that plane. By the time Caldwell was led out of sight, hashtags bearing his name were already climbing. His attempt to twist the story at 36,000 feet was gone. The evidence lived in dozens of cameras and hundreds of witnesses who had found their voices together. Amid the chaos, Marcus stepped into the terminal, his backpack slung over one shoulder, Sophie close by his side. He blinked against the lights and the blur of strangers' faces. His cheek still throbbed where the slap had landed, but the deeper ache inside him had shifted into something else, something steadier. Then he saw his father. Dr. David Williams pushed through the crowd, his tall frame cutting forward with a single focus. His hands shook as they closed around his son's shoulders, pulling him into a fierce embrace. Tears pressed at the corners of his eyes, but pride anchored his voice. "You're safe. Thank God you're safe." Marcus pressed his face into his father's chest, the strength he had held onto during the flight finally breaking. "He hit me, Dad," he whispered, the words muffled. "But they stood up for me. He didn't win." Dr. Williams's arms tightened. "You don't ever let a man like that define you. You hear me? You are more than his hate. You are everything he'll never be." The reunion was raw, a release of hours of fear and pressure. Sophie watched quietly, relief flooding her own face. Around them, passengers passed by, some pausing to pat Marcus on the shoulder, others offering quiet words of encouragement. Then came the cameras. News crews, alerted within minutes by social media's storm, swarmed the arrivals hall. Microphones extended, questions fired rapid and unrelenting. "Marcus, how did it feel when?" "Dr. Williams, will you press charges?" Did the airline respond appropriately? The noise closed in like another kind of turbulence. Marcus flinched, turning his face toward his father. "I don't want this. I just want to go." Dr. Williams shielded him with his arm, his expression cold toward the reporters. "No comment. My son is not your headline." The security team pushed the crowd back, guiding father and son toward the quieter edges of the terminal. Yet the truth remained. Justice in the digital age was not contained by walls. By nightfall, millions would see Marcus's face, hear Caldwell's slurs, watch the slap that had sparked a firestorm. The ripple effect was undeniable. A single act of courage, multiplied by strangers refusing silence, had turned one boy's humiliation into a national conversation. Still, in the center of it all, Marcus only felt the need for peace. He paused, glancing around the terminal. Amid the blur of uniforms, cameras, and rushing passengers, one face was missing. The man who had stood first. The man who had turned the tide. Michael Cabbage. Marcus scanned the crowd, rising on his toes, searching every cluster of people. Nothing. No gray jacket, no steady presence lingering nearby. Somehow in the chaos, Michael had slipped away unnoticed. "Dad," Marcus said quietly, eyes still searching. Where did he go? But there was no answer. Michael was gone. The airport emptied around them. Reporters drawn elsewhere, officers guiding Caldwell into a black van outside. Yet for Marcus, the absence of one man echoed louder than the chaos that had just unfolded. Michael was gone. No handshake, no interview, no lingering moment of pride, just gone. Dr. Williams searched with his son, eyes sweeping over the thinning crowd. "He must have slipped out," he murmured, his tone puzzled. "People like that, they don't usually just walk away." But Michael had. He'd left as quietly as he had stood, without fanfare, without credit. And in the space where he should have been, there was only an emptiness that carried its own kind of weight. Later, when Marcus reached the hotel his father had booked for the competition, a folded envelope waited for him at the front desk. His name scrawled across the front in steady handwriting, Marcus Williams. The clerk handed it over gently. "An older gentleman left this for you. Said you'd understand." Marcus tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single page, lined and simple, written in dark ink. "Marcus, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not far, but gone enough. I didn't stand up today to be remembered. I stood up because for too many years I didn't. I let silence win and it ate at me. I've carried that regret like a stone in my chest. But today, for once, I set it down. Don't mistake this for heroism. I am no hero. I am a man who's lived long enough to know that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and too often, people let it. I let it, and I promised myself, with what time I have left, I would not again. You have more years ahead of you than I have left. Use them. Stand tall, even when the world tells you to shrink. Speak, even when silence is easier. Don't fight every battle with fists. Fight them with dignity, with knowledge, with the strength that says, I belong here. Because you do. Always. Marcus's eyes blurred as he read. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder, steadying him, but he barely noticed. The words burrowed too deep. The letter continued. I wasn't supposed to be on that flight. Truth is, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere much longer. Cancer has given me months, maybe less. I could have stayed home, waiting to fade. Instead, I bought a ticket. Maybe fate put me in that seat. Maybe not. But I know this. When the moment came, I chose to stand. And that has given me more peace than any medicine ever could. Don't look for me. I don't need parades, and I don't need thanks. My life has been long. My regrets longer. But today was different. Today, I walked away lighter than I felt in decades. I will carry the memory of your strength with me until the end. And I pray you will carry this, the knowledge that even when the world is cruel, you are not alone. Courage has a way of multiplying. You saw it on that plane. Strangers became protectors. Fear became defiance. That is what change looks like. Marcus swallowed hard, his chest aching. The note felt heavier than paper should, as if it carried the weight of Michael's entire life inside it. At the bottom, one final line stood apart, written with a firmness that made Marcus stop, his breath catching. Live loud, because I can't anymore. The noise of the airport faded, but the memory of what happened on that plane would not. One man's hatred had struck like a blow, but it had not been the final word. What lived on instead was the image of strangers standing together, refusing silence, refusing fear. Hate grows strongest when it hides in quiet places, when people avert their eyes and convince themselves it isn't their battle. But hate falters when voices rise, when dignity becomes a shield, when courage multiplies one person at a time. That flight was not just about Marcus or Michael. It was about everyone who chose to stand instead of shrink, everyone who chose to speak when silence was safer. In that moment, unity became its own form of justice. And justice, even at 36,000 feet, could not be denied. One act of courage rarely ends with the person who begins it. It ripples outward. It strengthens the hands of others. It tells a boy struck in the face that he matters, that he is not alone, that the world is not always cruel. It redeems the regrets of an older man who had spent too many years quiet. It transforms ordinary passengers into witnesses who decide together that the line has been crossed and must never be crossed again. The truth is simple. Hate can rise in silence, but it dies in unity. And on that flight, unity won. Have you ever witnessed injustice and had to decide whether to act? Share your story in the comments below. We read every one. And if you believe no child should ever face hate, if you believe standing together matters, then like this video and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Join this community that refuses to stay quiet, because silence only strengthens the wrong side. One slap tried to silence a boy, but one stranger's courage reminded us all, hate loses when good people stand.